I woke to the sound of voices drifting through the thin hallway, the kind of low conversation people have when they think the walls will keep them safe. The clock on my nightstand blinked 6:14 a.m., its blue light catching the edge of my glasses. My body felt the usual morning stiffness, the small protests of a man in his 70s. As I pushed myself upright, a single sentence slid through the air, soft, sharp, and wrong. "He doesn't need 2 meals a day." My daughter-in-law's voice, clear enough that I knew I hadn't imagined it. A quiet unease spread through my chest, the kind that doesn't announce itself loudly, just settles in like a weight you can't shift. I took a breath and listened. My son answered her in a hushed tone, too faint for the words to carry. But the rhythm of the conversation was all tension, quick, clipped, and cautious. They were trying to keep something contained. That alone told me enough to move slowly as I stepped toward the doorway, steadying myself on the frame before heading down the hall. The kitchen light cast a long rectangle across the floor. They stood near the counter, shoulders angled toward each other, both speaking so low I could barely hear the ends of their sentences. "Too much responsibility," my son murmured. "Has to be reduced somehow," she answered. The words felt rehearsed, like they'd said them before, and were trying to say them again without being overheard. I stayed just outside the spill of light, watching their silhouettes shift. On the table, a folded nutrition plan sat open, something I recognized from the clinic. It belonged on the fridge, but it had been pulled down and written on. I stepped closer, pretending to reach for my water glass. Their conversation halted instantly. The printout had markings I didn't remember, lines through certain recommendations, calorie counts crossed out, new numbers scribbled in margins. Whoever wrote them hadn't bothered matching the doctor's handwriting. This wasn't an accident. I felt my pulse slow, not from fear but calculation. Someone had taken the time to make changes, and the changes didn't match anything I'd been instructed to follow. I might get tired more easily these days, and sometimes I misplaced a name or forgot where I left my keys, but my mind was still my own. I knew what I was looking at. I knew what it meant when people spoke quietly in a house they didn't expect you to wake up in. My daughter-in-law turned and saw me standing there. She froze for a second, just a second, but it was enough to betray her reaction. Her smile came too late and too stiff, her voice too bright as she said good morning. My son looked down instead of greeting me, eyes fixing on nothing in particular. I reached for the water glass and noticed the pill box beside it, the weekly one I kept in the cabinet. It had been rearranged, days switched, compartments shifted. I touched the lid lightly, cold plastic, something that should have been untouched, the kind of detail someone hopes you won't notice. The room stayed quiet for a moment, thick with something unspoken. They waited for me to say something. I didn't. I simply nodded, lifted the glass, and took a drink. My silence made them uncomfortable, and I let it. Whatever they were discussing, whatever changes they thought they could slip into my routine, it wasn't forgetfulness, it wasn't carelessness, it was intentional. And now, I was awake. The morning moved slowly after that, the house settling into its usual rhythm while my mind refused to settle with it. I brewed my coffee the same way I always had, letting the familiar sound of the machine steady my thought. As I watched the cup fill, I couldn't help thinking about the years my son and I had spent alone after my wife passed. He had been young, too young to understand the weight that loss drops onto a man's shoulders, but I carried it and raised him as best I could. There were nights when the house felt too big for just the two of us, but we managed. I cooked, worked, kept the routine stable. Hunger was something I knew how to manage, something I expected to return in a different form decades later. When my son married, I noticed early on that his wife wasn't fond of anything that resembled caregiving. She kept her distance whenever chores involved care rather than convenience. At the time, I chalked it up to personality differences, the kind people eventually work around. I didn't think much of it then. Marriage brings adjustments, I told myself. Not everyone finds the same comfort in looking after others, but small things add up in the corners of memory when you're forced to revisit them years later. My grandson, on the other hand, always seemed to notice things most adults overlooked. If I skipped lunch because I was distracted fixing something in the shed, he'd appear in the doorway with a sandwich already made. He didn't ask if I was hungry, he just assumed I should be. He got that from his grandmother. She used to place food in front of me before I realized I needed it, claiming it was better to stay ahead of the body than chase after it. My grandson carried that instinct the same way some boys carry their grandfather's eyes. Quiet, unforced, caring. My son tried to keep the peace between us all. Whenever I questioned something his wife did, even gently, he urged me to trust her method. His voice tightened a little when he said it, like he knew the words didn't sit well even as they left his mouth. She introduced rules, schedules, and routines that looked organized on paper, but always felt slightly off in practice. Still, I tolerated it for his sake. Families bend before they break. The first real doubt crept in the day she suggested downsizing my meals to avoid waste. She said it casually, like she was tossing out an idea that made perfect sense. But it didn't make sense, not with my doctor emphasizing again and again that my medication required consistent, balanced nutrition. Cutting meals wasn't efficiency, it was interference. And once something like that plants itself in your thoughts, it doesn't disappear easily. Around the neighborhood, whispers had started circulating about older residents dealing with quiet forms of neglect. Nothing dramatic, just stories of missed appointments, forgotten meals, or mixed up pills. People call them accidents, but too many accidents can form a pattern. I didn't like how closely those stories now brushed against my own house. I remember the doctor's words during my last visit. "Food is part of your treatment," he had said. "Don't take shortcuts." I had taken that seriously. I wished everyone in my home had. As I finished my coffee, the unease I felt earlier didn't fade. It grew roots, not enough to draw conclusions, but enough to change how I watched the day unfold. Something in this house was shifting, and I needed to understand how far it would go. The first break in routine came quietly, tucked into an ordinary morning like a seam coming loose. I walked into the kitchen expecting to see the plate my daughter-in-law usually set out for breakfast, but the counter was clear. No eggs, no fruit, not even toast. I opened the fridge myself, half expecting to find a note or something set aside. Instead, there was nothing prepared at all. When I mentioned it casually later in the morning, she brushed it off as a simple mistake, claiming she thought I had slept in. It didn't sound convincing, but I nodded, as if it made sense. The second time it happened, she told me the planned breakfast ingredients had spoiled overnight. Her voice carried the kind of practiced concern that didn't fully land. I checked the fridge after she left the room. Everything looked fine. The eggs had days left on the date. The bread was still soft. The fruit had no marks. If anything, the fridge looked fuller than usual, but arranged in a way that felt staged, like things were there for show, not use. Later that week, I sorted through the mail and found the grocery receipts tucked in with the flyers. I glanced at them out of habit and paused. The numbers didn't match what I expected. The budget I gave each month hadn't changed, but the list of items purchased had shrunk noticeably. Less produce, less protein, less of anything that counted as a meal. I set the receipts aside, not saying a word. The difference was small enough to deny, but large enough to matter. When my son came by that evening, I brought up the missing breakfast again, testing his reaction. He repeated his wife's explanation without thinking. "She said the food spoiled," he said, shrugging. "You know she's careful," but he didn't check the fridge himself. He didn't ask for details. His trust in her was smooth, automatic, and absolute. I could see how easily that could be used, and not for his good. The following morning, she placed a noticeably smaller portion on my plate. She told me to avoid overeating, saying it was better for my age. Her tone made it sound like advice, but my doctor's instruction had been clear. My medication required consistent nutrition, not rationing. She knew that. She had been at the appointment. I nodded anyway, studying her face for anything that might reveal more. She didn't meet my eyes long enough to give me anything to read. I made a point of eating slowly, watching how she hovered near the counter, checking to see how much I finished. I offered no complaints. Not yet. Observing was more important than reacting. That night, my grandson sat beside me at the table, fork in hand, eyes flicking between his plate and mine. "Why is your portion smaller than mine?" he asked. His voice held no accusation, just confusion. My daughter-in-law stiffened for a moment before telling him it was just part of his diet plan. He looked unconvinced, but didn't push. His question lingered in the air even after he left the room. I couldn't prove anything, not then. But patterns form long before proof arrives. And the pattern here was becoming hard to ignore. I started paying closer attention after that, not with suspicion that showed on my face, but with the quiet tracking of a man who'd learned long ago that details tell the truth faster than people do. Each morning, I noted whether breakfast appeared on time. Each evening, I checked the size of the portions she placed on my plate. The pattern grew sharper with every passing day. Meals missing, portions shrinking, explanations getting thinner. I didn't ask questions. Questions make people careful. Silence lets them reveal more. One afternoon, when the house was quiet, I opened the drawer where she kept my nutrition chart. I slid it out slowly, laying it flat on the table. It didn't look the same as I remembered. There were pen marks altering the recommended calorie intake, numbers lowered, entire lines crossed out. It wasn't doctor's handwriting. It wasn't mine. Whoever had changed it didn't even bother matching the style. The adjustments weren't accidental. They were deliberate. That same day, a medium-sized clue surfaced when I logged into the meal delivery service I'd used for years. The auto-delivery settings had been changed from full portions to half portions without my authorization. The timestamp showed the modification happened 2 weeks earlier, on a day I hadn't touched the computer. My stomach tightened, not from hunger, but from the clarity of what I was seeing. Food wasn't being forgotten. It was being reduced at the source. Later in the week, I stepped outside to get the mail and ran into my neighbor, Mrs. Hartley. She hesitated before speaking, glancing toward my house as if checking who might be listening. "I saw your daughter-in-law take out a couple of sealed meal boxes the other day," she said carefully. "They looked unopened." She wasn't accusing anyone. She was trying to understand. I thanked her without revealing how much her words confirmed. Back inside, I sat down and opened my doctor's patient portal, reviewing the dietary guidelines for my medication. The instructions were simple: consistent meals, adequate calories, and no long gaps between food. Every line I read pushed the situation further into a place that didn't feel like misunderstanding. What she was doing didn't match any medical recommendation. It aligned with something else, something intentional enough that I felt a cold certainty settle across my shoulders. I began documenting everything. The notebook stayed in my nightstand drawer, tucked under old receipts and reading glasses. Each entry included the date, what meal was served, what was missing, and any odd remarks she made. I kept the altered nutrition chart folded inside the back cover. Quiet proof builds a strong foundation. I wasn't going to move without knowing exactly where I was stepping. 2 days later, I checked the meal service again. Another reduction had been queued for next month. No hesitation, no pause, as if the plan assumed I wouldn't notice at all. I reversed the change and printed the confirmation for my record. Then I carefully put the papers into the folder the doctor had given me at my last checkup. By the end of the week, I had enough questions to take to the clinic, but not enough answers to confront anyone. And confrontation without evidence is just noise. I needed clarity, the kind you can't get at home, only in a place where someone understands what real care looks like. So I made a quiet plan. The clinic would be my next step. The clinic smelled like disinfectant and warm air, the same familiar mix I'd known for years. I checked in at the front desk, expecting the usual routine, but the receptionist glanced at her screen and frowned. She tapped a few buttons, looked again, then asked gently, "Did you know your last 2 nutritionist appointments were canceled?" I felt the question land somewhere low in my chest. I hadn't canceled them. I hadn't even known they were scheduled. Before I could respond, she added, "They were marked as canceled by your caregiver." I sat down in the exam room, the paper sheet crinkling beneath me, thinking through every morning that had felt slightly off. When the nutritionist entered, her warm smile faded the moment she looked at the chart. She asked me to step on the scale, jotting down the number with a long, quiet pause. "You've dropped more weight than we expected," she said. Her tone wasn't panicked, but it wasn't calm either. She moved through her notes slowly, scanning page after page, as if she were piecing something together. Then she held up a form I'd never seen before. "Why does your diet plan say meal reduction due to cognitive decline?" she asked. The words were clinical, but the impact was sharp. I felt the room tighten around me. "I've never been told anything like that," I answered. My voice stayed steady, but my mind raced. Someone had added that note. Someone who wanted it there. The door opened before either of us could say more. My daughter-in-law stepped in, her smile already stretched too wide to be genuine. "Sorry I'm late," she said, waving her phone in the air. Traffic was awful. The nutritionist held up the form. "Can you explain this modification?" she asked. My daughter-in-law barely glanced at it before shrugging. "Well, He doesn't need that much at his age, she said. The sentence fell out of her mouth without thought, the same careless tone she used when she dismissed minor chores at home. The nutritionist's expression changed, not anger, just firm, professional concern. She looked at me, then back at my daughter-in-law, seeing something she hadn't seen before. It was subtle, but unmistakable. A shift from routine care to suspicion. Trying to recover, my daughter-in-law stepped forward, placing a hand on my shoulder in a gesture she rarely used. He gets confused sometimes, she said. We're just trying to manage things better. That was the moment the air in the room shifted completely. The staff had heard accusations like that before, and they knew exactly what they sounded like. I met the nutritionist's eyes, and she saw immediately that confusion wasn't my problem. She closed the chart carefully, set her pen down, and spoke with a seriousness I hadn't heard from her in years. I'm scheduling an emergency evaluation, she said. We need to make sure your care plan is accurate and safe. Her tone told me everything I needed to know. She understood the risk, and she wasn't going to let it slide. My daughter-in-law stiffened beside me, but stayed silent. She knew she had said too much. I left the clinic with a new weight in my chest, not from illness, but from clarity. Something inside my home wasn't just broken, it was being manipulated, and now someone else finally saw it too. The nutritionist asked my daughter-in-law to step into the hallway for a moment, under the pretense of updating paperwork. The door closed softly behind her, and the room settled into a different kind of quiet. One meant for truth, not comfort. The nutritionist pulled her stool closer and lowered her voice. I need to be direct with you, she said. Her tone was firm, stripped of anything gentle. This is intentional malnutrition. The words weren't dramatic. They were clinical, factual, and cold enough to steady my breathing into something sharp. She laid the documents across the counter. Pages with incomplete meal logs, calorie counts crossed out, altered diet papers marked with handwriting that wasn't mine or hers. She tapped the printouts from the meal service next. The orders were changed. Someone reduced every delivery. There was no question in her voice, only confirmation. I looked at the papers and felt the pieces locked together in a way that removed any chance of misunderstanding. She picked up her tablet and said she needed to loop in my doctor immediately. Within minutes, he joined by video call. His face tightened as she turned the screen toward the evidence spread out across the exam room. This isn't a clerical mistake, he said. This is a pattern. His concern was deep, layered under the professionalism he tried to hold. He asked if I had knowingly approved any of the changes. I told him I hadn't signed or authorized a single one. That was when the nutritionist slid another form toward me, this one showing a signature beside my name. Your daughter-in-law signed this on your behalf 3 weeks ago, she said. The lines on the page blurred for a moment before settling again. It wasn't my signature. The loops were wrong, the spacing different. Someone who didn't know my handwriting well had tried to mimic it. My doctor exhaled slowly, his voice dropping lower. I need you to understand something. Malnutrition in seniors is sometimes used to justify moving them into facility care. It can be framed as needing more supervision. He didn't say the rest, but I heard it anyway. Someone could claim I couldn't care for myself. Someone could use this as leverage. And someone in my own home seemed willing to create the conditions for that claim. The nutritionist closed the folder with a quiet snap. We're reporting this, she said. It's not optional. It's required. You're at risk. She didn't look angry, just resolute. Her job wasn't to take sides. It was to protect health, and today, that meant protecting me. The room felt colder, but my mind was clear. There was no denying what had been set in motion inside my own house. No pretending the missed meals were oversight. No excusing the altered documents as misunderstanding. Whatever was happening, it had crossed a boundary that couldn't be walked back. I nodded, letting the decision settle in my chest. We'll report it, I said, but let me be prepared first. She studied me for a moment, then gave a single understanding nod. She knew preparation wasn't hesitation. It was survival. As I left the clinic, the sky looked the same as it always did, but the world beneath it had shifted. I wasn't walking home to uncertainty anymore. I was walking home to a truth I could no longer ignore. The days that followed felt like living inside a house with shifting walls. Nothing moved loudly, but everything moved. My daughter-in-law started appearing at my door with small plastic cups of supplements instead of meals, calling them easier on the system. She set them down with a firmness that suggested she expected agreement, not questions. When I asked about breakfast, she said, "These are better for you." without looking me in the eye. Her confidence was growing, not from care, but from assuming I wouldn't resist. My son visited one evening with a stack of papers tucked under his arm. He sat across from me at the dining table, his expression tense, almost rehearsed. "We should consider signing some care documents," he said. "It would ease the pressure on all of us." He didn't explain what pressure he meant. He didn't ask why I looked thinner. He just pushed the pen toward me. I told him I'd read them later, letting my voice sound uncertain, the way he expected. He accepted it too quickly, relief flickering across his face before he left the room. Meanwhile, the nutritionist stayed in constant contact, sending quiet messages to keep me steady. She coordinated with a social worker who began reviewing the evidence, altered logs, canceled appointments, reduced deliveries. They worked silently, carefully, making sure nothing tipped off the wrong person too soon. The social worker asked for dates and descriptions. I sent everything I had. The folder on my nightstand grew thicker each day. At home, I started acting a little slower than usual, letting my steps drag, letting my voice soften. My daughter-in-law interpreted it as decline, and her confidence sharpened. She began hovering less, as if she believed her plan was working. She pushed smaller portions with a casual tone and reminded me to stick to the schedule, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was easier for her when she thought I was slipping, but my grandson saw what she didn't. He watched the dinner plates closely, his eyes narrowing at the portions. He lingered longer in the kitchen, hovering near me as if trying to understand, without asking. One afternoon, I found him sitting quietly on the porch steps, waiting for me. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His presence alone told me he felt the shift in the house. Sometimes children sense danger long before adults admit it. As the pressure tightened, my daughter-in-law began cracking at the edges. She snapped over small things, crumbs on the counter, misplaced keys, the mail arriving late. I watched her rush through rooms, snatching envelopes before anyone else could see them. Twice, I saw her slip letters into her bag instead of placing them on the table. Her hands trembled when she thought no one was looking. Stress reveals truth faster than confession. I kept my own pace steady, using the space she gave me to prepare. Each night, I gathered the documents, every altered form, every receipt, every photograph of the reduced portion. I arranged them in order, labeling them with dates and brief notes. I kept the clinic reports at the front of the folder, exactly where the social worker instructed. When I finished, I placed the folder inside my coat, ready for the moment it would be needed. The house felt like it was tightening around all of us, waiting for something to give. My role was clear now. I wasn't stepping into the confrontation, unprepared. I was walking toward it with everything I needed, one careful breath at a time. The smell of something warm drifted through the kitchen, but when I sat down at the table, the plate she placed in front of me looked more like a garnish than a meal. A thin slice of bread, a spoonful of vegetables, barely enough to call a portion. She set it down without meeting my eyes, then placed a small pill in her palm and held it out. "Just take this instead," she said. "It'll keep you steady." Her tone was brisk, final, as if the decision had already been made for me. I picked up the pill but didn't swallow it, keeping it hidden in my hand as she turned toward the counter. The room felt tight, the air too still. I heard the front door open, quiet but firm. Footsteps crossed the hall. My daughter-in-law froze when the nutritionist appeared in the doorway, wearing her clinic badge and carrying a clipboard. "Good morning," she said evenly. "I'm here for a wellness check." The color drained from my daughter-in-law's face. She forced a smile. You should have called first." "I did," the nutritionist replied. No one answered. Her eyes moved from the tiny meal to the pill in my hand, then to the fridge. "I'd like to take a look at your food storage, if you don't mind." Before anyone could respond, she walked straight to the refrigerator and opened it. The shelves looked full at first glance, but she reached behind the arranged items and pulled out 3 unopened meal boxes, still sealed, their labels showing they were deliveries from the past 2 weeks. She set them on the counter one by one. "These were supposed to be part of his daily intake," she said. Her voice wasn't raised, but it carried the weight of a verdict. My son walked in from the hallway, stopping short when he saw the nutritionist in the kitchen. His eyes moved from the discarded meals to the plate in front of me. "What's going on?" he asked, voice tightening. She didn't turn toward him. Instead, she pulled out her folder and laid several printed documents on the table. Photos of diet sheets with altered numbers, records of canceled appointments, screenshots of reduced meal deliveries. "This is evidence of tampering," she said. "Everything here contradicts medical orders." My son looked at the papers, and something in his face cracked. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and stared at the tiny serving on my plate. His silence told me he finally understood. My daughter-in-law stepped forward quickly, pointing at me. "He doesn't remember things clearly," she said, voice shaking. "He gets confused about what he eats. I've been compensating. No," the nutritionist cut in sharply. "He is alert, consistent, and fully aware. I've examined him myself. His memory is intact." She picked up the altered diet sheet. "This handwriting is not his." Then she picked up the pill from my hand. "And this is not part of his prescribed regimen." The kitchen felt smaller with every passing second. My daughter-in-law's breathing hitched as she looked from the evidence to my son, who still hadn't spoken. The front door opened again. This time the steps were slower, more deliberate. The social worker entered the kitchen, carrying a file of her own. My daughter-in-law backed up a step, panic settling around her like a shadow finally exposed. She knew exactly why the social worker was here. And for the first time in weeks, I felt the ground beneath me steady. The days after the confrontation passed with a quiet formality, each step handled by people who dealt with situations like mine far more often than they wished to. Social services moved quickly. They gathered the evidence the nutritionist and social worker had collected, added my written notes, and filed formal elder neglect charges against my daughter-in-law. The language in the report was clinical, stripped of emotion, but the meaning was unmistakable. What had happened in my home wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a violation of care. My son was notified next. He arrived at the house pale and unsteady, holding a letter he didn't seem ready to read twice. His role wasn't the same as hers, but his inaction carried weight. Because he hadn't verified anything, because he hadn't asked questions when routines broke, he lost his health proxy privileges. The document that had once allowed him to make medical decisions for me was revoked and reassigned. It wasn't punishment, it was protection. But I saw the pain behind his eyes, even as he tried to accept it. My daughter-in-law faced a deeper investigation. The falsified caregiver documents, forged signatures, and altered diet sheets formed a trail that couldn't be explained away. She didn't return to the house. Papers came instead. Official notices, requests for statements, dates for hearings. The system she tried to use as a tool was now the system she had to answer to. The nutritionist and doctor prepared their reports with the precision of people who understood the stakes. They wrote clearly about the changes in my weight, the canceled appointments, the altered logs, the reduced food orders. They emphasized that my cognitive tests were normal, my medication required stable nutrition, and my independence should remain fully intact. Their words stood like a shield I hadn't known I needed until it was there. When the review hearing was scheduled, my grandson asked if he could come. He didn't explain why. He didn't need to. The nutritionist met us at the courthouse, her presence steady and reassuring. She greeted him with a nod, then placed a hand on my arm. "We're here with you," she said. It was simple, but it grounded me. The hearing room was smaller than I expected, with muted walls and worn chairs that made everything feel more personal than procedural. The judge read through the reports one by one, pausing occasionally, as if measuring the weight of each sentence. My daughter-in-law sat across from us, eyes hollow, hands clenched tightly in her lap. I didn't look at her long. I didn't need to. Her presence didn't sting as much as the reality that she had spent months shaping a life I didn't recognize. When it was my turn to speak, I said only what mattered. I didn't talk about hunger. I didn't talk about weight or meals. I talked about trust, how quiet it breaks, how slow it cracks, how heavy it feels when you finally see the pieces on the floor. The judge listened without interrupting. In the end, he ordered strict protections for my care, restored meal plans, full medical autonomy, routine home visits from a caseworker, and a legal barrier preventing my daughter-in-law from acting in any caregiving capacity. My grandson reached over and held my hand while the judge finalized the ruling. His grip was steady, grounding. As we walked out of the courthouse, the air felt clearer, but not lighter. Vindication does that. It lifts the threat, but leaves the sadness behind. I didn't mourn the food I missed. I mourned the trust that had been starved long before I realized it. The house felt different once the protections were set in place. Still quiet, but no longer carrying that thin layer of tension that had settled into the walls over the past months. My meals returned to normal, prepared by me or delivered exactly as the doctor ordered. I could feel the difference almost immediately. Food was no longer something rationed behind my back. It was part of my strength again, part of the routine that grounded me each day. My weight steadied, my energy returned, and with it came a kind of independence that I hadn't realized had been slipping away, piece by piece. I set aside an entire afternoon to update every legal and financial document I owned. My attorney walked me through them with patient clarity, making sure nothing could be altered or signed without my direct consent. Witness requirements were added. Alerts were put in place. Copies stored where they couldn't be quietly replaced. There was no fear in the process, only a calm understanding that protection isn't paranoia when it's built from experience. As the days settled into a new rhythm, I found myself thinking less about age and more about trust. How easily it can be misplaced when you assume love guarantees good intentions. Age doesn't cloud judgment. Blind trust does. You don't feel the danger until you're already living inside it. That realization didn't make me bitter. It made me careful. And being careful doesn't take strength away. It gives it back. When neighbors asked how I was doing, I didn't offer long explanations or warnings. I just shared the simple truth that matters. Read everything. Question urgency. Don't let anyone rush you through decisions meant for your own well-being. Advice doesn't have to be loud to be worth hearing. Most of the time, quiet truth lands better than anything shouted. Therapy became part of my routine as well, not because I felt broken, but because clarity is easier to maintain when someone helps you sort through the pieces. The nutritionist requested weekly wellness visits at first, then spaced them out as my health improved. Every time she stopped by, she checked the fridge with a small smile, pleased to see it filled the way it should be. We didn't talk about the past much. We talked about maintaining what had been restored. My grandson stayed close through all of it. Sometimes he helped me with groceries. Other times he just sat on the porch with me after school telling me about his day. He didn't mention what happened. He didn't need to. His presence carried a quiet loyalty that said more than words ever could. Children see more than we notice, and he had seen enough to learn something that would stay with him far into adulthood. One evening, after we finished dinner together, he asked, "Are you okay now?" I looked at him, really looked, and nodded. I wasn't just okay. I was aware, steady, and stronger in ways that only truth can make a man. When the house finally grew still that night, I turned off the lights and let the quiet settle around me. There was no fear in it, no doubt hiding in the shadows, just peace, earned, protected, and understood. And as I stood there in the dark, I spoke the line that had carried me through the worst of it. Growing old isn't the danger. Trusting the wrong people is.